And with that, I will hand it over to Erica Pascal. And Erica has been a long-time Catalyst advisor. She was a scientist, she's an IP attorney, and now she has her own firm, and she will tell you more about herself.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Yes, I am a former scientist gone over to the dark side who became an attorney. And what I do now is I work almost exclusively with startups, all between the pre-seed and Series C stage of life, when they are really in their formative years of figuring out IP strategy, and we'll talk about what that means. But today, what I thought I'd talk about a little bit is put it in the context when you have a project that's still sitting at the university, trying to decide what it's going to be, right? And, you know, what does that mean for intellectual property? And we'll talk about what that is today. Because there are so many of you, and I can't see like the little hand raise that people do like on Zoom. If you have questions, you should just interrupt me. We have just a half an hour because you have another presentation on regulatory. So some of this might go a little faster than I intended. However, I will provide the slides to Rupa so she can distribute them. And that includes my email. You should feel free to just reach out and ask questions if you have curiosities about IP. Okay, so things you should think about before you even get into the IP side of things is, what is the product of this service or service of the company, or what is it going to be, right? Some companies offer a service, like I have a client that does mass spec analysis of blood samples, right? People send them samples, they do the service and send back data. Sometimes you have a product, they're developing a drug, they're developing a diagnostic, they're developing a medical device. What is the landscape of competitors they operate in? Not just who has the same technology, but who's addressing the same needs in the landscape, right? And how are they protecting that? What advantages does your company have over what's out there? What the competition, or what's just sort of standard of care? And then how would you protect that advantage with IP? And we'll talk about patents a little bit. We won't really talk about trademarks today and trade secrets. So IP strategy, in a sense, is basically how you protect what you've got, how you protect your innovation, and how you clear the path to market, right? Because intellectual property, we'll talk about, is, you know, everyone has their own, right? You have your own patents, your own trademarks, your own trade secrets. You don't want to infringe on others, right? So that's part of the creating a clear path, knowing out who else is out there, what's in your way, and can you kind of drive around it or get access to the technology you need from others. And similarly, when you have really good innovations, can you actually protect them? Because otherwise your competitors could just copy, right? And that wouldn't give you any advantage in the market. For you all, when you're dealing with university projects, one of the questions that comes up with professors or postdocs or graduate students or starting the project at the university is, what is the end game, right? Do you want to license out your technology? Universities do this all the time, right? There's a tech transfer office, or they go by different names at universities, that actually reaches out to companies and says, hey, we have this really cool assay or compound or whatever. Do you think it would fit in your portfolio? Some people who are at a university want to start a company. Sometimes they want to leave the university and like literally take on sort of a new phase in their career and do a startup. Others want to stay associated with the university, and they need to figure out a way to transition the technology into a startup that they may be a founder or an advisor, but someone else is going to have to run the day-to-day because they're going to continue being at the university doing their university job, right? A company is not really a hobby. If you really want to make it fly long-term, you're going to need folks on the ground, boots on the ground, getting things done. Okay. So today we're going to talk about really only two parts of IP, which are patents and trade secrets. There's also trademark and copyright. We're not going to talk about those too much. Well, actually, we're not really going to talk about them at all, only to say copyright tends to play more of a role if we're in the sciences, more in things like software. It does come into play with like service manuals and stuff like that, but not in a really strong way. Trademark is branding, right? Those are names of products and drugs. Again, not dealing with it here. And generally, when you're doing a startup and you're just starting out, it's really too early to sort of have trademarks, right? Because you don't have anything in the market. But patents and trade secrets really form the foundation of what a startup or you know, an early idea that may be useful for licensing will have. All right, we're going to start with patents. There is this urban legend that if you file a patent application and get a patent, you will have freedom to operate, meaning you will have a clear path to go forward with your product or service. Unfortunately, that is exactly an urban legend. It's completely false. Freedom to operate is a question of what other people have, what other patents are out there from other third parties, universities, companies, whatever, that you don't own, and whether they get in your way. Patentability, you know, whether your innovation is new and innovative, is how you get a patent. We won't go into it today. Happy to sit down with you and show you how this weird Venn diagram works. But basically, you can have a really nice, strong patent and still not be able to bring your product to market if someone else has a dominant patent that you would not be able to make your product without getting a license or some other rights to that patent. Okay, so patents, I don't know how many of you have looked at patents. Not everyone comes across them in their everyday life, but they are granted by governments in the US, by the US Patent and Trademark Office. Europe has its own one. Every country, almost every country has its own patent office. And patents basically prevent others from making, using, selling, offering to sell, or importing your technology that you have claimed in the patent. They are country specific. So if I get a patent in the US, I can stop others from copying me in the US. But if I only have a US patent and you go over to Japan, you can do it in Japan. There's nothing I can do about it unless you try to import back in the US. So depending on where your company is going to operate or where you think your technology is going to be important, it will be important to file patents in those particular countries. Patents last typically 20 years from filing date. There is some exceptions to that for drugs, but that's a 20-year monopoly, right? So once you file your, we'll get to what we call a PCT application, the clock starts ticking. So if your patent gets granted really fast, like in a year, you have 19 years of patent term yet left. If it takes you 10 years to convince the patent office to actually grant the patent, 10 years is off the clock already, right? We'll talk what that means because that does become important. Another big important thing is that patent applications publish before they grant. So if I file my technology, other people are going to see it before the patent grants. A patent isn't enforceable, and meaning you can't stop someone from using your technology that's claimed in the patent until it's granted. So that's another big thing. And patent claims we'll talk about in a little bit are negotiation, but we'll get to that. So a patent, if you haven't looked at one, you can pull them up on Google Patents, right? The important part for what it really covers in terms of what you can prevent others from copying is in the back section of where it says what is claimed. When these are granted claims, whatever's listed in those claims is what you've protected. Everything else that's in the rest of the body of the patent, which we call the specification, is support, but there may be lots of stuff in that support section that is not part of the claims, and you have no right to stop anyone copying. So for example, if I describe PCR in the body of the patent in order to make, for example, some of the nucleic acids that are claimed here, and then I, have this assay here for, making these particular primers, what's actually protected is the method here with all these different steps, not all of PCR. You can get patent claims on products like drugs or a medical device or part of a medical device, but you can also get method claims, methods of making a drug, methods of using a drug, like treating patients, methods of a diagnostic assay. There are many different flavors of claims. I listed some of them out here for drugs, but it would be the same, variations on this theme for something that was a medical device, something else that would be a diagnostic, right? Diagnostics, you would have your components that go into the assay, the actual assay itself, for example, and maybe even a method of a treatment. If you were having a method of treatment where you first did your diagnostic assay and then based on that result, decided what treatment would be applicable to that patient. So IP protection or strategy is sort of layers, right? And here I've shown one for a drug, but again, you can make the same sort of egg or onion, some people call it, for any type of technology. For example, in drugs, you might have the active ingredient that you might patent, the actual compound, or if it's a biologic, let's say the protein. The formulations, like the pharmaceutical formulation that you actually make to administer it, maybe as an, injectable. Methods of making, literally the synthetic way you make the active ingredients and or the formulation. Sometimes there are key components. I have one client that has a patent on a method of making a biologic because it must be only exposed to a certain wavelength of light. If you go outside of that range, it inactivates the drug. Methods of use, we talked about, like methods of treatment. And then for drugs, you often have combinations, either with other drugs, other medical devices, or combinations with diagnostic assays. You can get patents on all of these. You can combine them all into one patent. You can separate them into different patents. There are many different ways of doing it.
What's the most effective way, in your opinion?
It depends on a lot of factors, very case specific. So for example, part of it will be some people start out with an active ingredient that's already published, so you can't get a patent on that. And so you're going to be focusing on the upper parts of this diagram. Some technologies require certain proof of concept. So for example, for methods of treatment, you often need at least small animal data. You may not have that at the outset, but you have data on your active ingredient and how you make it. So you might first get that patent application and then file later. Some of it's cost driven. So again, it's just very case specific. There's not a one size fits all. Usually I sit down with companies or, professors or whoever's, pushing the technology forward. And we talk about the different strategies that would work for them based on the timelines of what data they have, when they're going to get it, and truthfully what their budget looks like too, right? Because you could file these each as a separate patent application, but then you'd have to pay for each of them. Okay, patents take a while to get. For example, this is a typical timeline if you don't accelerate, right? Acceleration in the patent office costs money, so most people don't do it. You file a provisional application, right? A provisional is basically, it goes to the patent office and it just sits there as a placeholder. Preserving basically says, I filed my invention on this date, which is important, right? Because if no one else has filed on the invention, you're the first to file. That means that's important in getting a patent. You can't be the second to file the same invention. There is no second place. You just lose out.
So I have one more question real quick.
Sure.
Sorry.
No,
So you said when you file a patent, it gets published before it gets granted. So there really is no danger in publishing it because no one's going to steal your invention because they're going to be second up anyways.
Well, yes and no. They won't steal it exactly, right? Because you're right. They would be copying and they would be second place. But let's pretend I'm your competitor and you publish, we'll stick with the piece, it's some sort of PCR assay. And I see it published and I think, well, that's neat. And I don't want to copy it exactly because I don't want to infringe your claims when you do get claims. But, I can improve on this and design around it and design a PCR assay that doesn't really use your method, but it builds on it, right? So I get competitive information. So this is often really important with drugs where you have a chemical scaffold, right? And you're patenting like the chemical space around that scaffold. And competitors will look at that patent application that publishes and find all the gaps where you either forgot or could not claim or describe other variations of the structure. And then they'll make those structures and see if they're active. And if they are, they'll file their own patents. It's called patent busting. Big drug companies do it all the time. Small drug companies do it too. So you have to keep that in mind, is that you're going to file your provisional. No one can see it here. You're going to convert sometimes to what we call a patent cooperation treaty, or PCT application, which allows you to file basically one application that will eventually mature into and go into different countries. But it's sort of like the Common College app. You get to just submit one application to go into multiple places. And then at 18 months, which is really just 6 months after that PCT filing, it publishes, at which point the competitors get a sense of what you're doing. So if you're trying to be a company that's being stealthy, right, you don't want anyone to know what you're doing, they're going to get a hint at month 18. There's just no way around it. And then it takes another 12 months after that before you start picking which countries to go in. Those are the countries where you want to get a patent granted. And then it could take another 1 to 5 years, sometimes even longer, to get each of those countries to grant your patent. And so it's just something to think about. Both their expenses at each of these stages, and it's just a lot of time till you get a granted patent. Meanwhile, your competitors have a lot of competitive information. So it's just something that goes into the strategy. Okay, I'm going to switch gears for just a teeny bit and talk about trade secret. So trade secrets, unlike patents, there is no filing. You don't officially file your trade secret. Trade secrets are basically an idea that's secret that has value, right? So the example I always give people is, you don't know what shampoo I used this morning. That's a secret in a sense, but it has absolutely no value, right? I am not a supermodel or something where someone would actually gain value from, marketing with my shampoo. On the other hand, if I'm a startup that makes shampoo and I have a secret formula that makes your hair shiny, and I don't want people to know what that ingredient is, then because it has value, it's better than all the other competitors' shampoos, then that's a good trade secret. The biggest thing about trade secret protection, because you don't file on it, is you have to keep it secret. Something that is very hard to do at a university, right? Because you have grad students, you have postdocs, you have visiting researchers, you have staff. You give a lot of research seminars. The whole purpose of being in a university is to share knowledge. So sometimes it's very hard to keep trade secrets. And so when you get into this mode where you're transitioning a project from the university to either a setting, some company, maybe not your own, but someone else's, through licensing, you're going to have to really think about how you're going to protect certain trade secrets, how you're going to delay publications or not give them to a graduate student that needs to put them in a thesis or what have you, in order to make this work. There's kind of pluses and minuses to trade secret publication protection. Unlike patents, it doesn't publish, right? So that's good. Competitors don't know about it. It never expires as long as you keep it secret. There's no requirements, right? To get a patent, there are certain requirements that your invention has to be new and inventive compared to what came before it. Trade secret just has to be secret and have some value to your company. And you're not waiting that long timeline like patents. On the flip side, right, it doesn't protect from independent derivation. What I mean by that is, if I have a trade secret and you steal it, meaning you sneak into my lab and you steal my lab notebook or you hack my computer, that I can follow up on and pursue through, the courts and other means. But if you come up with the same idea independently, never having looked at my stuff, and we just arrive at the same place, too bad, so sad, right? I don't have a trade secret anymore because you came up with it yourself. And sometimes it's actually difficult, even when someone steals a trade secret, to know, right? Especially if it's a method like a fermentation method and they're doing it in their own lab in another country. How would you even know what they were doing? So again, this is one of these things of IP strategy where you just sit down with your IP attorney and you talk through what things should be kept as trade secrets, what things need to be patented or protected through some other means like copyright and such, and come to a balance. All right. Lastly, and maybe relevant for the projects you're doing, is you kind of want to know what landscape you sit in from an IP sense. In other words, if you're filing patent applications, right, or thinking of doing that, you want to know if your competitors have filed something similar or not. You want to know if your competitors have something that's going to get in your way. You want to know what's out there in the research literature, right? If I publish my research on a particular antibody, it's going to be very hard, in some countries, impossible to patent it once it's published. And this is another dilemma with universities. Is often, I've worked with professors who have been working on the same subject matter for a really long time, and they published certain things 5 or 10 years ago because that's what you do at a university. And then now they're like, oh, I want to start a company with that and I want to patent it. And you're like, well, you can't patent it because you already published it. We need to think of other layers that are on that egg or onion diagram that you can still get protection by, because the things that you already published, that train left the station a long time ago. So one thing you may be doing, or someone may do, is you'll get out and like look at Google patents or some of the public search engines. And you have to realize that remember I told you patent applications publish. Those are not necessarily issued patents, right? So the claims that are at the end of an application are not the issued claims. They're kind of like people's wish lists, like a list you make for Santa Claus, what I would like for Christmas. You wish you had claims that broad. That may not be what the patent office decides to grant. So I'll give you an example for US, how you can tell the difference between these two things. These are two cover pages. The left-hand side is an application, meaning it's published but not granted. And the right-hand side is a granted patent. With the application, it always starts with the first 4 numbers are the year number, right? So this published in 2016, and it has a date that's a pub date, meaning publication. And in case that isn't enough of a hint, it actually says patent application publication, right? It doesn't say patent. On the right-hand side, issued patent, it's called a patent. It has a number that does not have the date related to it because they started with patent number 1 and now they're up to 11 million and something. They just go in sequential order and they have the date of the patent. It's only the claims in the issued patent that are enforceable. This gets a little more confusing with other countries. Some other countries don't change the numbers between application and grant. So there are other ways of knowing. If your application number has an A after it, that means it's an application, it's not granted. If it has a B after it, that means it's a granted patent. For example, in Europe, it will have an EP number for Europe and then a B at the end, or a B1 or a B2 or something like that. The other thing to notice is PCT applications, right? So if I go back a few slides really quickly, this PCT application that publishes here at 18 months is going to have a WO number. It's going to be like WO 2023 / and a bunch of numbers. Anything that has a WO number is an application, it is non-issued patent. And the reason I'm telling you this is kind of this cartoon. Most people see the applications and freak out thinking it's a real lion, whereas in the end of the day, the patent office may not grant those really broad wish lists, and the claims may be significantly narrowed and not a problem for you, and it may just be like a little paper tiger. And the only way you're really probably going to know that is to sit down with a patent attorney and let them help you with that analysis. And that is not an ad for me, it's just advice.
How do they get to choose what to keep and what to get rid of?
So it's a negotiation. So when you file your application, right, you list. So say I want all antibodies that bind to PD-1, and the patent office will come back and they'll look at what's in the research literature and other patents, and they'll say, hey, there are like 20 other PD-1 antibodies out there. You can't have all PD-1 because someone's already invented a whole bunch of them. But you disclosed a very particular antibody that is different than the other 20 that's out there. That's what you get. So you're going to get a very specific PD-1 antibody, not the whole world. Now, sometimes there's an intermediate compromise, and basically the way this works is your patent attorney corresponds with the patent office and they correspond back. It's mostly done in writing, and they kind of negotiate back and forth. And when they arrive at something that the patent office says, yeah, that's okay, that no one else has, published or invented that before, then you get your granted patent claims. And if you can't find a compromise with them, then you don't get a patent. It just goes away. There's money down the drain. So in the last 2 minutes, just we've sort of covered this. These are the type of questions investors ask, or companies that are licensing technology. They're trying to figure out, is your innovation patentable? Meaning, will you actually get a granted patent at the end of the day, or is it too close to something that's already been published or sold? Does someone else have a patent or even a patent application that can mature into a patent that's going to be a potential threat to you, meaning it covers your technology, but you don't have rights to it? And so, a lot of what you do as a small company starting out and continuing as you grow is to look at your competitors, figure out what IP they have, figure out how to express why your technology is different and why it has competitive advantages and why people should invest in it or take a license to it. Okay, and my final slide, this dog, is to remind me that while IP is important for companies and particularly important for growing and starting biotech, med device, drug, all that sort of anything in the life sciences, it should not be the tail that wags the dog. In other words, you make a product not because you can protect it by IP, you make a product because it has a reason to be in healthcare. Right? If there is no market reason, you can get loads of patents, but it isn't going to help you if there is no use for it, right? So some people get really into the whole patent space and forget that they're developing a product, right? And suddenly their patent strategy goes one way and their product strategy goes the opposite. So that's my pitch there. This is me. I will give you these slides. Like I said, you can reach out by email if you just want to have a chat or have questions. Happy to be a resource. And I'm going to leave it there because I know that there is another speaker. And
thanks a lot, Erica. That was great. And if anyone has one or two pressing questions, go ahead. Thanks again, Erica, for a great talk. And
thanks, everyone.
And now bring on David Pudwill. David Pudwill is ex-FDA, Mr. Regulatory, and he's going to talk about regulatory stuff, medical devices and others. So David, take it from here.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and pull up PowerPoint. So can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep,
yes, we can see.
All right, perfect. So, all right. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview about how we got here in terms of various medical products getting regulated in the first place. I love this picture, and you can find this picture. I've got a link to it at the end of the presentation that I'll share with you. There's a bunch of photography from FDA that they put out there, but this is how FDA views the world. So it's important for you to think about this kind of an image, and what the regulators must be thinking about patients interacting with your product, in this kind of a context. So this explains a lot of, from my perspective, how we got here. And to give you a little bit more history, when you're looking at food and candy and a lot of these things, there are a number of news reports over the years about various toxins and poisons that ended up in our food supply, and so that led to the regulatory situation that we have today. I'll give a little bit of a timeline in a second. Some other really interesting images along the same lines. And one that I really like is this one as well. So there used to be these firecracker balls that were sold, and they look like candy, and a number of children would try to bite into them. And so FDA has actually regulated even things not intended to be edible, or pushed for regulation, to make these kinds of products not legal to be sold on the market because of the risk to human health. So a little bit of history. I won't read everything here, but FDA history goes all the way back into the 1800s, and it really got started with the poison squad around 1900. There's a little bit of a call out here to Harvey Wiley, who was the chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry, doing some of that work. And then we moved in to the modern era, and FDA has continued doing some modernization. We ended up getting regulation for medical devices, and we've continued to see advancements in the regulatory space. I was actually hired to work at FDA under one of the MEDUFA. These are the user fee funding authorizations that have happened over the course of the last number of years. And this just gives you a little bit of a highlight for some key dates. And a lot of this is available just on FDA's website. So what does FDA actually do? They're responsible for protecting the public health, and they're responsible for advancing the public health. And we'll get into some of the mechanisms here later for how they actually go about doing that. And here's a little bit of an overview of how FDA is organized. And just a shout out to where I was at in the Office of Health Technology 1 through 8, named a little bit differently at that time. There used to be divisions and offices that then were combined into this super office at FDA. And there's a lot more collaboration between pre and post market now at FDA after some of those changes. So we'll get into a little bit of more around definitions as well in terms of what a drug or a biologic is, because that also, a number of you may be developing, products in these spaces. We'll get into digital health in a second as well. But we really start with drugs and biologics in terms of definitions, and it's actually a negative definition in terms of devices for, if you're going to be regulated as a medical device, you can't be classified as a drug or a biologic. So a drug is defined as a substance that's recognized by an official pharmacopoeia or formulary. It's intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. And it's a substance other than food that's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. And it's intended for use as a component of a medicine, but not a device or a component, part, or accessory of device. And these products will be acting chemically or affecting a biological process. And there's a little bit of detail here. I won't get into it, but some great graphics just talking about drug and biologic review processes. I'm going to focus a little bit more on medical devices, but if you have any questions about any of this, I can steer you in the right direction. And it's a long, involved process. If you're working on drug and biologic development, I wish you well, and I can help you out along the process. But it's a long and involved journey if that's what you're doing. In terms of medical devices, it's slightly less painful, though only slightly, maybe. And a device is going to be intended for the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. And it's also intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man, which does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action. Specifically, some of the definitions we get into here are if the mode of action is in or on the body, okay, in terms of whether we're talking about a medical device, and then the chemical action in terms of it not being a drug. So then we get into things like digital health. So digital health, according to some of these definitions, is going to fall fairly clearly into the definitions for devices, at least as they've been established in the US. And FDA has been doing a lot of work in the space of digital health. They've set up a center of excellence, and they're working to connect and build partnerships, share knowledge, and innovate regulatory approaches and they have done some pilot programs to try to figure out how we can drag the industry and FDA, for that matter, into the modern era in terms of regulations. And Jeff Shuren has been very active in this space. He's the head of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And there's a lot of interaction between FDA and Congress and in reauthorizations to expand the scope and focus the efforts of our regulatory structures, at least within the U.S. So then we really want to figure out, okay, so what is a mobile medical app? What is this kind of a software? And a number of you are working with various software products. Mobile medical apps specifically are going to run on smartphones or other mobile communication devices. So we're talking about software only kinds of products. So when you're thinking mobile medical apps and some of the guidances that FDA has out, that's what you should be thinking about, is something that's running as software only. It's a type of software as a medical device, potentially, depending on how that might be classified. And FDA takes a risk-based approach for regulating devices specifically. And so depending on the intended use and the target population, you can fall into some various categories. You can either be not regulated as a device, and FDA has put out some guidance on that. You can fall under what's called enforcement discretion, which means you are a device by FDA's definitions, but they've decided effectively to give you a hall pass and not to regulate you as a device, even though they can. And then those products that clearly are under the definitions of what is regulated, and FDA does intend to regulate those things. So that's your sort of tiering for how you want to think about software kinds of products. And specifically, FDA's provided a lot of what's called enforcement discretion in this space of mobile apps. I won't go through everything here, but some of this, some of what FDA regulates is carved out in terms of what Congress has laid out in the law, and a lot of what FDA has decided not to regulate, they've done so of their own volition. So here you've got a little bit of basis, hopefully here, and I really want to get into some basic principles for how you should think about regulatory strategy. And mostly, I just want to let you know, if you're in a regulated space, you need a regulatory strategy, just first and foremost. And this is going to be a living document and plan. It's going to include your business strategy for the product. And you should have a regulatory, assessment. And what a regulatory strategy is not is something that you're going to file away. It's just a paperwork exercise. It should be a living document. It's not just blueprints and a design of a device. You need to know how you're going to use the product. Develop a business and marketing strategy around that. And you can then, with that, chart your path towards what does that mean in terms of your regulatory pathway, and what makes most sense for how you're going to actually use the product. And it's also not something that's stagnant or fossilized. It's something that needs to it needs to be current. You need to keep these documents up to date. And when you're thinking about this space generally, and regulation and working with investors and how all these things can go, everything is good until it isn't. Okay, and that unpredictability is something that can make people nervous. It can mess up your funding and your relationships with investors. So you really want to get out ahead of these kinds of things, and take appropriate measures to reduce that kind of a panic response when things don't go quite the way you anticipate. And some practical things that you can be doing is when you're working with your contract manufacturers, making sure that you have a really good picture about what it is that they're going to do for you. Make sure that you visit, if you're going to use a contract manufacturer, visit the facility, get answers to your questions. Here are a couple types of questions that you could be asking here on this slide. And you really need to make sure that you have in mind that verification and validation activities for whatever it is that you're going to be doing. If it's a regulated product, it's going to be a steep climb. It's not going to be a downhill paved road that you're on in the kinds of spaces that you guys are working in. It is going to require some effort, and it's going to be more difficult than you initially expect and imagine. So plan on that. And it's important, when you're thinking about if you need clinical evidence, figure out what it is that you already have. I was just talking with somebody this week, and she had some clinical data that could be leveraged for interactions with FDA, but she was working on developing additional, clinical information. And you need to figure out, okay, what data do you already have, and what data can you leverage to potentially make some progress? And it's possible that you've got more than you think you do just right out of the gate. And then the second thing is just making sure that you spend some time on your trial design. Bring in people who can help you. Make sure that you're on the right track there. And you really need to make sure, if you're doing clinical trials, that you have good oversight. This is where a lot of things fall apart from a regulatory standpoint. There are going to be issues. You need to make sure that there are clear responsibilities, and you need to stay on top of the documentation and the management of the clinical trials if you're conducting them. Because the goal is that you're going to have good data that you can use on the back end in a regulatory submission, and for just general marketing purposes for that matter. So when thinking about clinical studies specifically, and a couple more ideas around firefighting in this space, it's important to if you're eligible for some of the expedited regulatory pathways we'll talk about in a little bit, that you consider pursuing that. There are possible partnerships with well-established CROs. Don't just rely even on a well-established CRO to just take something and run with it. You need to make sure that you're also engaged and involved with all of this, and make sure that you're engaging with FDA early, and make sure that you also have a sense of what your best and worst case scenarios and timelines look like, so that you can make sure that you don't run out of funding part of the way there. It's also important to make sure that you're maintaining good relationships with FDA. Introduce your device clearly to FDA. That means you need to know what it is that your device is, or what it is that your product is, and what unmet need that you're going to be addressing with it. And figure out what scientific questions that need to be asked for your product, and really understand what it is that FDA can and cannot do. FDA can give you feedback on a plan that you've established, but you shouldn't go to FDA asking them what you should do. You should have a sense of what it is that you should do, working with experts in the field and interacting with your users. And you should really have a good sense of what it is that your plan is, and then work with FDA on laying out what your plan is, and they will give you feedback. It's also important to think about, in terms of timing for when to submit a pre-sub. Do you have a new device or technology? You should think about getting in front of FDA as early as you can with some kind of an interaction. If you're changing your indication for an existing device, you should plan on speaking with FDA. If for some reason there's an unclear regulatory pathway, that's a good time to think about engaging with FDA. And there are a couple items here as well around IVDs. But these are the general kinds of considerations. Things like this is what's going to drive whether you need to have an interaction with FDA to begin with. But I generally advise that you do interact with FDA. And one way that you can do that is in an informational meeting. So this is an opportunity to share information about your product with FDA without specific questions for them, just as an introduction to the technology. This is if you're very early stage and you're still working on figuring out, prototyping and, making iterative improvements to the product before you would get into any clinical studies or, do any other kind of performance testing. You can get in front of FDA early, and then follow up at some future date with another pre-submission where you're asking specific questions about protocols. But if you do have questions, then think about going straight to that. And two common mistakes in terms of FDA engagement that I want to highlight for you is, one, not considering the timing, of your request. You want to really, figure out how your device is positioned, currently, whether it makes sense to go into FDA at this point in time. Consider your planning needs in relationship to, where you are along the development path. Really make sure to leverage that potential to interact with FDA prior to costly and timely studies that you're going to have to do, whether that's animal studies or bench studies or other kinds of clinical work that you might be doing. The other common failure or common mistake is if you don't get clarity from FDA. If FDA gives you an answer but you don't really know what they mean, or you think you know what they mean, don't go with that. Ask them. Feel free to follow up. Make sure in the meeting, if it's during a meeting, get clarity from FDA, or follow up shortly after the meeting if there's some lack of clarity. Just ask. I can't tell you the number of submissions that I've seen where companies came into FDA presenting a bunch of information, and FDA effectively asked the company, why'd you give us all this? All that we needed was X. You went way above and beyond what we needed, from a regulatory submission standpoint. So don't let that happen to you, or don't let a situation arise where you come into FDA and you give them something and they wanted something entirely different, and you spend all of this time and money and energy trying to answer a different question than the one that FDA actually wanted you to address. And then in a couple more minutes here, we'll get into some practical considerations. I'm going to provide you a lot of slides and resources here, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this as we go through. So there's some detail here on FDA risk based categories for medical device classifications, low, medium, and high. Some details in terms of what that regulatory process can look like. For class 1 products, you just need generally to register your facility and list your device. For class 2, oftentimes this requires you to prepare and submit a 510K, which is a substantial equivalence determination. The timelines for that are slightly faster, but you need a product on the market that's similar to yours, or high risk or class 3 products. These are usually unique products. Sometimes there are products just like them on the market, but this is going to take a longer time period. FDA is going to have a higher bar and requirements, and FDA is going to look at manufacturing details, which they generally would not do for class 2 devices. There are a number of products that are exempt from FDA regulation, both in class 1 and class 2 devices. And in many cases, there are FDA regulatory controls or special controls in place, and you can find that specifically in the Code of Federal Regulations that are publicly searchable. I like ECFR, but you probably don't need to know that if you're finding somebody like me to help you out. And generally, you can do some of this research on your own. But you're generally gonna have better success if you get a little bit of regulatory help from somebody who knows what they're doing. A high-level overview of 510Ks. There are about 4,000 510Ks every year. There are standard and small business fees, and I can share some details on that. Every year you need to get a small business designation if that's something that you're planning on pursuing. I advise you guys to think about that. and make sure that you can get that paperwork together. That can save you thousands and thousands of dollars. Is definitely advisable to make sure that you're doing that if you do qualify as a small business. The overall timelines here, these are FDA days, so don't misunderstand. I'll share some timelines a little bit later, but day 90 is not 3 months from the day that you submit to FDA. That's 3 months of FDA time on the clock, so they can have some back and forth and send you some questions, and then now the ball's in your court to address those questions and come back to FDA. So it's not just a 3-month process. Oftentimes that takes 180 days on average between start and finish to get a product through FDA review. And then for PMAs, for pre-market approval devices, these are higher risk. The fees are higher. The savings are higher in terms of small businesses. Your first PMA is free, in terms of the FDA fees, but don't let that fool you. There are a lot more fees to come if you're a PMA device down the road. And oftentimes, I'll start here with some total time goals is just sort of for your information. A couple other submissions that you should be aware of, primarily pre-submissions, which we talked briefly about, and investigational device exemption submissions, or IDEs. Also, a number of you might have de novo products. I don't expect too many of you would fall into the humanitarian device exemption category, but it's possible. And then there are a couple other notable submissions. So again, here, most of this is just going to be for your reference, but I definitely recommend that you go into FDA and get feedback in terms of Q submissions from them. If you get written feedback only, FDA will sometimes respond to that more quickly. But I generally advise people to think about asking for a meeting, because you can always cancel the meeting after they give you written feedback if you don't need any clarifications. But if you ask for written feedback from FDA, they don't let you then put a meeting on for the same submission. You have to follow up with a follow-on submission. So I generally advise people, in most cases, they want to request a meeting, and they'll get written feedback in advance of the meeting. And then if you don't need to hold the meeting, then you can cancel it. But it doesn't particularly work well the other way around. So, and then in terms of investigational device exemptions, these are free in terms of FDA costs. The decision time for this is 30 days. FDA has gotten fairly good over the last couple of years about making sure that they're approving most investigational device exemptions within that first round of review. So for a lot of you, if you do a good job of putting that submission together, you can get a first round approval from FDA, or a conditional approval to start your clinical study. Usually that happens, or that's more likely if you've had some pre-submission interaction with FDA in advance, talking about protocol development or any preclinical studies that you might have to do in advance of going into humans. A little bit of detail here around de novos, and how that might look. So this is if you're a medium risk class kind of product, but you don't have a predicate. There's not a device like you on the market yet. It's a little more involved. It's somewhere between 510K and PMA, but it's a little bit more like a 510K. But you're getting a brand new classification for your product from FDA. And then there's a humanitarian device exemption pathway. This is meant to make it possible for products that are going to serve a very small number of individuals a year to get to market without some of the same costs that would otherwise be a burden on getting this kind of technology to market. But there aren't very many HDEs that make it onto the market nonetheless. A 513G, I generally advise people not to use this pathway. I've seen a couple cases where it's useful, but it's rarely a good idea. You should probably talk to somebody in a regulatory space rather than pay FDA $3,000 to $6,000 to get a 513G request answered. And then you might fall into a situation where FDA hasn't decided exactly where you fit in terms of classification. So this is when you would do a request for designation. I've gone through this process on a number of occasions, and familiar with it on both the FDA and industry side of things. And put some time and thought into it. A lot of people are trying to get FDA to decide that a combination product should be regulated as a device primary mode of action, but just be very thoughtful, about whether that makes sense, or whether what you're requesting in terms of designation of, who the primary reviewing center would be. Make sure that you've thought that through in terms of all the ramifications, because sometimes it makes more sense to be regulated as a drug or as a biologic, but oftentimes I see people pushing in other directions. And then in terms of the post-market, what do you do now? So you've got a product, you've actually made it through the gauntlet, you've gotten a product onto the market, or you're a class 1 product, or you're exempt for some reason. If you need to, you can register and list. You would register your facility and list your product. You would have to start making sure you have a complaint handling system set up to do adverse event reporting and medical device reports. You need to do product monitoring and potentially do device recalls or product recalls. And you have to make sure that you're reviewing your promotional materials so that you're staying within the bounds of what's acceptable from a regulatory compliance standpoint. And you need to know when to submit supplements or new 510Ks for various device changes. Conduct necessary post-market studies depending on the scenario you find yourself in. And you need to file annual reports for PMAs and HDEs. And I'm going to provide you a bunch more resources here. I won't really get into it, but there are CDRH IT enhancements that exist and are coming. There's some details on where to start with submission help, who you can call at FDA, where to search and find guidance. And you can get on FDA's email update list if you want and keep up to date. There's some details here on FDA's proposed guidance development. Take a look at this because it might be affecting the products that you're looking to develop. So take a look at FDA's A and B list. This gives you an idea about those guidances that FDA is looking to publish soon. And also take a look at those guidances that were published in the calendar year that we're coming up on or that's further ahead. If a guidance that affects your device was published in that same in the same ending year number, so if it's 2023, we'd be talking about 2013 guidances or 2003 guidances. You want to keep that in mind because FDA is looking to potentially reissue or issue updates to those guidances at those 10-year marks. There's also some detail here around breakthrough devices and what you need to do to qualify. Some details here on Safer Technologies program if you don't qualify for breakthrough. Then some details here on timelines, how long things take, give you a sense here. Ignore that last little bit there. I give you a resource here. If you notice that timeline, it drops, but that cohort is not yet finished. So if you look at what FDA is actually doing today in terms of review, it's pretty consistent, in terms of what those timelines are. So this information that you might see in some places can be deceptive. FDA's review timelines have not decreased. And for de novos, same kind of thing. If you look at that, it's sort of a general, progression upwards, over time. PMAs, there's some information as well, but I don't have the same nice dashboard that one of my former FDA colleagues put together yet for PMAs. Maybe he'll do that at some point. And some details here in terms of pre-submission performance and what you should anticipate in terms of timing. You should get written feedback within 70 days. FDA's pretty consistent about that over the course of the last couple of years. And that wraps it up for me, a couple minutes over. Any
Thanks
questions?
a lot, David. That was great. And there is a question in chat from
Okay.
Peter, and it was, do telehealth apps fall under FDA regulations?
Yes. So there's some guidance there. So depending on what we're talking about, some of the telehealth, FDA has put into enforcement discretion. But it depends on what you're going to be doing, with that. If you're making, available things that, a doctor, wouldn't be able to, to access, if we're talking about just standard photographs on an app or something like that, or making video, available, these kinds of things fall under enforcement discretion, or they're not regulated. But there are some products in that telehealth space that FDA does regulate, yes.
You'll be sending the slides to Nate and me that we can pass it on, right?
I will, absolutely.
That's
David,
great.
I have a question. My name is Faz, and I was wondering, like, the PMA, or the acronym, I forgot, the one that was like 8,000 patients or something.
HDEs, yes, an HDE.
HTE. So that one, does that apply for like orphan diseases and stuff?
So FDA has it depends on the product that we're talking about, but yes, there are orphan, sort of status, or you get a humanitarian use designation on the device side of things before you can get before you can submit an HDE. But if you have an orphan product or an orphan disease, that you're talking about, I can point you in the right directions. Feel free to email me if you've got specific questions.
Yeah, I have a question for a drug, not a device, but a drug.
I can direct you to the right resources for that, nonetheless.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. And thank you everyone for attending. And Nate has recorded the session, and you all should get a recording and the slides too.
Perfect.